Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Blue South. We're excited to announce a video format of each episode now available on our YouTube channel of the same name. Be sure to visit our Instagram bio to learn more and check out today's available soon there as well.
Today, we're going to be doing a short recap of President Biden's first 2 weeks of office, covering some of his most recent executive orders, as well as the reception by the general public. But first, here's some breaking news.
Right, so Fox News Media has canceled Lou Dobbs' show, Lou Dobbs Tonight, benching its business network's highest rated host and a vocal supporter of former President Donald Trump. Both Dobbs and Fox face a billion-dollar lawsuit over false claims about the integrity of the 2020 election. The move, which was first reported by the Los Angeles Times and confirmed by a Fox News spokesperson on Friday, came one day after Fox and Dobbs were named in the $2.7 billion defamation lawsuit brought by Smartmatic, a voting software company that was the subject of several false claims made on Fox News and Fox Business. In a statement, Fox News spokesperson portrayed the move as something that had been planned prior to the lawsuit. The statement reads, as we said in October, Fox News Media regularly considers programming changes and plans that have been in place to launch new formats as appropriate post-election, including on Fox Business. This is a part of those planned changes. Dobbs' show, Lou Dobbs Tonight, will be replaced by Fox Business Tonight, with rotating hosts Jackie DeAngelis and David Asman. Uh, the Smartmatic suit alleges that Fox News, three of its hosts, Dobbs, Maria Bartiromo, and Jeanine Pirro, and Trump lawyers Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell defamed the company by falsely claiming that Smartmatic was used to rig the 2020 election. In at least 13 different instances, those hosts or guests advanced demonstrably false claims about Smartmatic and its role in the 2020 election, including claims that it was being used to change the outcome in battleground districts. If Fox News were forced to pay Smartmatic $2.7 billion in damages, it would wipe out almost all of the profit that the company made for its parent company, Fox Corp, in the fiscal year 2019. Daniel, what are your thoughts on this?
They kind of dug themselves into a real hole with this one, right? I mean, they're the ones who decided to um, kind of keep this going. They kept this going until the very last second. So honestly, I'm very not surprised this happened because this was bound to happen. I mean, they have these sort of people on their shows, and they knew this was essentially coming. They knew that like these people had the exact. I mean, I'm glad that Fox News did something about it. I mean, they could just ignore it and perpetuate the stigma that the 2020 election was rigged, and they could just continue it. But they obviously did not. I'm glad that they had some sort of morals in order to do that, because obviously that means that they're going a step into the right direction. But yeah, they really dug themselves into a hole with this one, and it's kind of shameful that they didn't act sooner. But
Right.
they realized that they couldn't do it uh, until the very end. So, Paul, what about you?
Well, what I was going to say was I just think this is kind of funny. Given Smartmatic is to a degree victorious in their lawsuit, it's just going to be sort of funny to see both the GOP and the GOP media extension puppet fall apart before our very eyes. Because I mean, we already know the GOP's in some pretty deep shit right now. And when we're looking at, Fox News itself dealing with all these legal prosecutions, the sort of deconstruction of some of their mainstay hosts who perpetuated a lot of this, right-leaning propaganda. I mean, honestly, they had it coming. If they continue to promote without people's best interests in mind and without a knowledge or a proper insight into what their viewer base really is composed of, if they continue to perpetuate these sorts of like conspiracy theories, then they 100% deserve whatever's coming their way.
Got it. Yeah. And Paul, I 100% agree with you. This is kind of hypocritical. It is pretty funny, but I mean, I'm sure we probably saw this coming already. So, once again, just another domino that's going to fall and going to trigger more dominoes regarding Fox News later on. But next up, so the NFL, the National Football League, told President Joe Biden that they're making all 30 of their stadiums available as mass coronavirus vaccination sites for the general public. Um, Nevertheless, this move seems to the mind of the public like that's not really that big of a deal. Uh, but that could definitely mean that the viewership of the NFL and people who usually don't really take the coronavirus that seriously and people that have been undermining the virus can now spread a message through football. So that's something even better. So 7 NFL teams are already hosting vaccinations for COVID-19 at or near their stadiums. So the NFL and our 32 member clubs are committed to doing our part to ensure that vaccinations are as widely available in our communities as possible. So that was a quote from Roger Goodell, the league's commissioner, and that's what he wrote to a letter to Biden on Thursday. We can expand our efforts to stadiums more effectively because many of our clubs have offered their facilities previously as COVID testing centers as well as election sites over the past several months. So that's what Goodell said. His letter to that each NFL would coordinate with local, state, and federal health officials in the vaccination efforts at the stadiums, two of which are shared by a pair of teams. So, overall, I believe this is a really good step by the NFL once again to show
Exactly.
that
And
they're not going to undermine the virus, and I think that's the biggest takeaway that I have from this.
And
Just to
what I really love about this whole thing is that Goodell noted that the NFL will have 7,500 vaccinated healthcare workers from across the country as guests at this Sunday's Super Bowl between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Buccaneers. I feel like this is just a very gracious measure taken by the NFL. It shows that this, plus, some of their involvement in the other like social justice activism we've been seeing recently, that the executives there, their hearts are in the right place, especially when they're trying to make, given their absolutely massive platform and their vast sphere of influence, they're trying to make a serious difference in our community, which I think is a beautiful thing.
And
And
we've seen
not
in the
only
past, and we've seen actually in the past with the NFL how they've had problems with like the Black Lives Matter and the kneeling
exactly,
and stuff like that. But I'm they're luckily taking the right stance and the right tone for this issue, which is not even a controversial issue, and somehow people have started to make it political. Which honestly, it's a disease, not political whatsoever. And luckily,
absolutely.
luckily they've chosen the right side.
And it's not just the NFL, the MLB as well. A host of professional baseball, I'm sorry, stadiums across the United States are already offering COVID vaccination sites to the general public. On Friday, a temporary vaccination site opened at Yankee Stadium in the Bronx borough of New York City, and another site at the Mets home field at Citi Field in Queens has been scheduled to begin offering shots at the end of January. That opening was unfortunately postponed because the city lacked enough vaccines. But on top of this, Los Angeles turned Dodgers Stadium into a mass vaccination site in January after serving as a mass COVID testing site for 8 months.
Perfectly capable of doing everything that they're supposed to. I'm glad that they're doing it because once again, we need to vaccinate as many people if we want to get out of this pandemic and get out of quarantine as fast as possible. But now,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Now, moving into our main topic of the day, President Biden has been in office for almost 2 weeks, and before taking office, promised to introduce new measures to combat the coronavirus crisis, reform immigration and climate policies, and push for economic relief, especially in the wake of the economic despair our country faced, with this pandemic well underway. And I think what we're going to do now is sort of compare what Biden has done in office in the first few weeks to what he promised to do, and maybe look at some insight into how this affected, the general population, what the reception was of these different policies. So, Daniel, do you want to talk about combating COVID-19, what Biden has done for that?
yeah, for sure. Well, I guess starting with combating COVID-19 is a great thing to start with. So first of all, we saw this $1.9 trillion bill that was introduced, really huge bill, and of course, we saw a lot of partisan divide between this bill. But that was one of the measures that he took in order to make sure that each American was receiving enough money in order to stay home and thus not spread the virus. So Biden promised to introduce new measures to respond to the coronavirus pandemic and boost the nation's vaccination effort. In his first week, Biden followed through on that plan by detailing the national strategy for a COVID-19 response and pandemic preparedness. preparedness. And
Preparedness, no,
so, yeah,
exactly.
yeah. And so this plan will include mandatory mask mandates for the first 100 days of an administration. That's what I feel like is the biggest thing, as we've always had a problem with people not wearing the masks, thus spreading the virus. And it is also promising to increase vaccination access. And so far, we have seen the vaccine distribution be a lot more effective than we have with the Trump administration. And the next topic I'd like to touch on would have to be
Immigration, right? Yeah.
immigration. Yeah.
So Biden kept his promise to introduce sweeping new immigration policies during his first few days in office, Looking at my notes here, in the first 48 hours of his presidency, Biden signed executive orders to strengthen the Obama era Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program and the so called Muslim travel ban, and institute a 100-day moratorium on deportations of immigrants at risk of removal who arrived in November. Biden's orders also ended Trump's border wall construction, which never really happened, and will ultimately provide a pathway to citizenship for, get this, 11 million undocumented immigrants. I mean, honestly, when I heard about this, just the thought of how many people's lives will hopefully in the near future be absolutely turned around, launched into, a scenario where they have a lot more opportunity to be successful, to make monies for their families, to, get a better education, seek safety. That's just an absolutely beautiful thing. And while I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, I mean, yeah, this is obviously bound to face massive amounts of opposition, especially from the Republican caucus. But I still feel as though if this is to a certain degree successful, I mean, this is just a huge step in terms of America becoming the inclusive haven for, the weary that we brand ourselves to be, written on the at the feet of the Statue of Liberty, if you know what I'm talking about, right?
I agree. I agree. And to add to that point, I do have to say that although Biden is in office 4 years, hopefully he can make change that's going to last for more than 4 years. So, should another Republican president be elected into office, cannot swing everything down within the matter of a quick year or two. So, I really hope that he can make some positive impact in our lives. And illegal immigrants actually are contributing a lot more to the economy than we actually think. Like we
They
were
aren't
talking about
taking jobs at all.
we were actually talking about it. I think in the last episode that the average illegal immigrant actually paid more taxes than Donald Trump did. So that shows you a statistic that um, obviously, like they are very beneficial to the economy. They're doing a lot and they're extremely helpful. There's no need to go against that. Why don't we go with it and help them have a path to citizenship at the end of the day?
No, right, exactly. And this doesn't just extend to immigration. Biden. We've seen some very progressive measures. Something that given that he's as further radicals, I consider myself pretty radical, as even further radicals like to describe him, and to an extent, I can see a corporate lapdog. I mean, that aside, I feel as though a lot of his policies he isn't given enough credit for. I mean, as someone who supported Bernie in the primaries, I mean, obviously, this isn't as far as we want to go, as we would have wanted to go. But when we're looking at a lot of these measures he's taken, I feel like he's living up and or surpassing the expectations of many who were, hesitant to support Biden in general. But this, like I said, this doesn't just extend to immigration. Daniel, do you want to talk about climate change?
Yeah, I think climate change is probably one of the biggest emphasis on the Obama administration, especially with the Paris Climate Accord. And as we saw on day one, he immediately rejoined it. That was extremely huge, especially since we're one of the leaders in the world. We're one of the world leaders, and we need to set a really good example for the companies that are the leading producers of carbon emission. So that's very good. Biden also ended the U.S. permit to build the Keystone XL pipeline and moved to discard more than 100 harmful environmental proclamations, memoranda, or permits signed by the Trump administration. All great things. However, I do want to note Biden did not sign an executive order to formulate a plan to achieve 100% clean energy economy and zero net emissions by 2050, as was promised during his campaign. And that was one of the things I remember that he worked with Bernie Sanders' campaign to kind of compromise on, to kind of pull the fan bases together. I really wish he would do this because I know that probably Biden most likely might not live to 2050, but for sure that both of us, I can say there's a pretty good chance that we're both going to live to 2050. And I
Yeah,
prefer to
don't do
like to,
drugs and we're good.
yeah, exactly. I prefer to have an Earth at 2050. So
Yeah.
for sure. And
Yeah,
so, yeah,
I like breathing clean air. I don't know about you. It's one of my hobbies.
no, I see what you mean. Yeah, we'd all do. But um, Biden so far has done great things. I mean, much better than Trump. And although I wish, like you said, Paul, that he would gone a lot farther, you can't really argue with what he's done right now. But of course, we're gonna have to step on this issue and step on the gas a lot more if we want to see
Right.
serious change happen in the future.
Yeah. Cutting ahead to student debt relief. I think this is one of the I believe, the second to last topic we're going to cover. But Biden kept his promise to pause federal student loan payments amid the health crisis. This executive order will allow students to forego their payments with 0% interest accrual until September 31st. However, Biden's pledge to forgive $10,000 of a borrower's federal student loans has yet to be detailed. And like I said, like I should have highlighted to a greater extent before we got into this, as much progress as he's made, it still leaves a lot to be desired. And while I do believe issues like student debt, while not necessarily 100% the foremost crisis we're facing right now, still deserve a lot more attention than they have been getting, not just by the Biden administration, of course, because he's only been in office for 2 weeks, but generally by administrations in the past. I feel like, student debt relief has always taken a back seat. And if we don't, bring that to the forefront sometime in the near future, what's the point of advocating for it now if we aren't going to see a change that affects us? I mean, obviously for the future, right? But that's going to put less, for lack of a better expression, it's going to not motivate us to have as much pep in our step.
I don't really see a way for debt to possibly get worse, but I do see a way for debt to continue to persist and continue to build up, which will then affect people's futures in the future. So yeah, like you can choose to ignore the problem or you can choose to address the problem, and it's going to make a huge impact on people's lives, not having to worry about the bills that they have to pay for education that they had to receive. Not to mention, like, I don't know, I think that everyone should have equal access to education, and having a financial barrier is just one of those ways that you're perpetuating our society that we've continued for so long. But the last topic that we'd like to touch on, actually, last two topics, would include tax reform and gun violence reform. And
Oh boy.
although gun violence reform is, I think, the biggest point that I'd like to touch on. I think tax reform. We'll start with tax reform, but in terms of tax reform, so Biden did fall short on his promise to eliminate the Trump tax cut for the super wealthy, cut the unjustified loopholes in our tax code, use that money to invest in America's future during his first week of office. Now, then again, we're like saying this is only his
We're
first week of
getting
office.
way ahead of ourselves.
We are getting
Exactly.
way ahead of ourselves, of course, but he hasn't done that yet, and that is something that I would like to see in the future. And to me personally, it doesn't really set a good tone because that's exactly something that I would like to see. However, he did have a 1.9 trillion relief bill, and it did not include any tax increase for the ultra rich. But I would like to point out that eventually, like, we are going to have so much deficits and debt build up, we're going to have to accumulate or neutralize that debt in some way. And higher
This is the
taxes higher
logic
taxes
and
are
ethical solution for it. Logical and
logic.
ethical.
Yeah, it's like we're going to have higher taxes. Now the question is, are you going to tax the middle class, or are you going to tax the upper class who has the money, or are you going to tax the people who do not have the money and who actually need the money? And there isn't a whole
The
lot with tax
concept of
reform,
the
but
concept of
yeah.
proportional taxation, I feel like, just falls deaf on the ears of so many people who automatically, of people like in my city making $30,000, $40,000 a year as salespeople and people and teachers, for Christ's sake, saying, "Oh yeah, Biden's going to raise my taxes. I want to be able to afford a comfortable lifestyle." I'm sorry, if you're legitimately that, if the concept of proportional taxation is that lost on you, and you seriously believe that taxing the wealthy is going to affect you in any way, that's just absolutely ridiculous. And I feel like Biden would have a lot better chance of pushing through these efforts of proportional taxation if people were able to somehow understand that taxing people who make literally 10 times as much as you in a year is not going to hurt you in any way. You know,
Exactly. In
for lack of a better expression, taxing the guy whose pool you're cleaning is not going to hurt you.
Exactly. It's unfortunately, it's only going to help you. Um, it's going to provide services, and it's going to redistribute the money back to the people who actually need it to hopefully make our society more equal and more helpful, and I don't know, just better in general, because then we'll have people who have equal access to everything and they won't be limited by anything financially. But the last thing that I think we're going to touch on
Gun violence
is
reform.
gun violence. Yeah,
Right.
gun violence is
So
huge.
Biden did not yet deliver on his promise he made to address gun violence, immediately. To quote, on my first day in office, I'm going to send a bill to Congress repealing the liability protection for gun manufacturers, closing the background check loopholes and waiting period. He said this on February 20th of last year. Biden has yet to introduce measures to address gun violence, but is expected to do so in his first 100 days in office. And like I said, when you're running as a political candidate, uh, I don't believe anyone expects you to live up 100% of the promises you made. And just to close this whole thing out, I mean, although Biden has gotten a lot done in office, we can't just call it a night now. I mean, it more or less settles it. We've seen great progress from the Biden administration so far. And while it still leaves a lot to be desired, we've gotten far in these past 2 weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that pretty much wraps it up for the Biden administration so far. And while it still leaves a lot to be desired, we've gotten extremely far in these past few weeks.
Right. And as always, we want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope you enjoyed the show. I'm Paul.
And I'm Daniel, and this has been the Blue South.